So it's nice to be here with you. Thanks so much for having me out. What I'd like to do, we have a fairly limited amount of time to talk about a topic around which I could talk all day long. So I thought what we'd do is kind of break it up into three halves, if that works for you. I'd like to talk a little bit up front about what does it mean to build green? What does it mean to build a green home? What does it mean to evaluate a product for its relative greenness? Then I'll share with you the story of our home, the house that my wife and I built, which, as Rose said, was our desire was to build the greenest house possible, whatever that meant. I'll share the story of that with you. But mostly I'd like to hear from you. Because when I do these talks, and I do them a fair bit, I'm always very interested in what's on your mind. What questions do you have, not just about our home and our journey, but maybe about your own journey? What things are you exploring in terms of increasing the level of greenness within your own lives? What myths or misconceptions might you be holding that you can just maybe throw out there and we can talk about and clarify some things? So I invite you, as the talk goes along, and certainly as we get toward that final third of our conversation, to just ask what questions might be on your minds, to say, I heard this, is that true? Or help me make sense of this choice versus that choice. Because what I do in my work through GreenPath Consulting ultimately comes down to choices. Helping people evaluate and make the best choices they can for living more lightly on the planet. And that's the kind of work that I try to do, and I hope that you're on that path along with me. So, what does it mean to build a green home? And this is the interactive portion of our program. I ask questions and you respond with insightful answers. So what does it mean to you to build a green home? What are some of the considerations? What are some of the things that need to be thought through if you're moving toward building a green home?
Renewable sources.
Okay, renewable sources. Where do the things that I'm going to build my home out of come from? To what extent are they renewable, or what other environmental impact might they have? Great, what else?
And conservation of resources, so you're not using extra energy or extra water.
Absolutely. So thinking through the energy conservation and the water conservation of both the manufacturer of the materials, as well as how those materials or products will use energy or water over the course of their operational life. Rose?
How do you think as many recyclable or reused materials as being built or being remodeled?
Okay. So the extent to which the materials themselves are recyclable, the extent to which you're conscientious of the amount of material you're using, what happens with materials you're not able to use and become waste, where do they go? Can they be reprocessed or repurposed in some other way? Other thoughts?
Making sure that you are planning it out so that you can get the best energy efficient home by either geothermal heating or solar heating.
So in terms of the design of the home and the systems that you're weaving into the home, to really look at maximizing the energy efficiency of the home. Great thoughts.
It's probably not a popular subject, but a lot of times when you're using reclaimed products, the cost is so much higher than, for instance, building a deck. I mean, if you build a deck, a board foot is $3.80. Well, if you buy that other material, it's like $9 a board foot. Thinking, whoa, wait a minute.
Well, it can be. Some of the materials that you would include in a green home can be more expensive. But there are other factors to weigh. If you're going to build with pressure-treated lumber, let's say, back to your deck example, what is the maintenance requirement for that over time? At what point, if you ignore the maintenance, will you have to replace that deck? Versus paying the extra money and getting a material that's going to last for a much longer lifespan. So when my wife and I were designing and getting underway with the construction of our home, we weighed those very choices. Budgets are limited. How much can we really afford, and where do we invest those dollars in the way that they make the most sense toward building the greenest house possible? Now, that's not our home. It is a green home, at least in color. But all of the things you shared kind of go into this consideration of what does it mean to really build a green home. So let's talk about now if we're going to weave products into your home. If you're going to make choices about decking materials, if you're going to make choices about appliances that you might include, what is it that makes a product green? So there are three things to consider. One is origin. Where does it come from? How is it manufactured? How much embodied energy goes into its manufacturing process? Where does it have to ship from? All of those considerations. If you think of flooring, for example, bamboo is a very popular flooring material right now. But bamboo doesn't grow around here, at least not naturally. And the bamboo that does grow around here is not the kind of quality that's made into flooring. Bamboo comes from Southeast Asia. And so there's a lot of embodied energy in the harvest, manufacturing, and ultimately the shipping of that product. Cork is another very popular green material. Cork also doesn't grow around here. And And so we weigh all of those things in terms of where do these products originate. The next consideration is its operation, the extent to which it minimizes energy usage and maximizes water conservation over the course of its life, the extent to which it impacts our indoor air quality, the air we breathe inside our homes. Is the carpet that we just installed, is it off-gassing volatile organic compounds? Those are all questions to ask. And durability, back to the deck question. Am I willing to pay more money up front for something that's going to last a lot longer or be less of a maintenance headache over time? So those are considerations as well. And then the final consideration is what happens when we're done with it? Is there something that it can be turned into that will still have a benefit to society? Or does it need to go to the landfill? And so those three considerations, origin, operation, and end of life cycle use, are things that we have to factor in when we're weighing any product against another product to try to make the best green choices possible. And so I'd like to share now 5 considerations for building green. If you're sitting on the thought process of designing and building a green home, these are 5 things that you want to keep in mind. The first is a no-brainer. It's called passive solar orientation. When you design your home, you want to angle it so that it maximizes the sun that comes into your home in the wintertime. And when we talk about passive solar, we're talking about something that looks like this. You probably realize that the sun is in a different position in the wintertime as compared to the summertime. In the winter, the sun is low in the sky. It moves low across the southern horizon. If you have a home that's oriented south, those low rays of sun will come right into your home and warm up the interior of your house. Free heat, right? Can't argue with that. But you don't want that same sun coming in the summertime because you don't want that free heat in the summertime. You're paying to try to cool things down in the summertime. In the summertime, the sun is very high in the sky, moves across the southern sky, but at a higher angle. And so you build your home with an overhang that blocks the sun coming in. So passive solar orientation is a no-brainer, but it's something that in designing and building homes, we've forgotten over time. People always used to orient their homes in that way. But when we got into building suburbia, subdivisions, all the homes kind of aligned with the road and with their neighbors. It didn't matter where the sun was. So the one thing to think about is how do we orient our home and maximize the free sun warmth that we can gather. The second consideration is insulation. Heating and cooling your home is by far the largest energy usage of that home overall. And so the extent to which you insulate your home to keep it warmer in winter and cooler in summer is a big consideration. Many of our homes are well under insulated. It's rare, actually, in particular with new construction, that homes are built with the level of insulation that they should have. In this heating zone, in this climate zone, the U.S. Department of Energy recommends an R value, which is the way we measure insulation, in the attic, let's say between R38 and R60. Most of us have maybe R19 in our attics. That's building code requirement. That's the minimum. And so there's a significant increase in insulation value that we can get there. So when we talk about insulation, we're talking about attic is the easy one. Most of us have access to an attic, and we can add more insulation if we choose. Talking about in the walls, that's a harder one. It's hard to get inside the walls once they're built. But if you're building from the ground up, it's something you can think about. If you're doing a remodel or replacing siding, let's say, sometimes you can access those walls. Floors, basement, all of those are considerations, and there are a wide variety of insulating materials now available. And just like we have to weigh one choice against the other, we have to weigh what insulation we're choosing carefully to be as green as we can be. Energy efficiency. When we think about the appliances we're bringing into our home, the heat pump, let's say, if that's the way we're heating and cooling our home, the water heater, the kitchen appliances, right down to the light bulbs. There are ways that we can maximize the energy efficiency of our home by choosing energy efficient appliances. The U.S. federal government has a program called Energy Star. Energy Star rates appliances. You can find the Energy Star website online, and it will give you a rating of how energy efficient one appliance is versus another. The next time you need a washing machine, the next time you're buying a cooktop or an oven, you can go to the Energy Star website and you can evaluate this choice versus that choice. Indoor air quality. This is one that's often overlooked. We often spend a lot of time in the house. And in the wintertime or foul weather times of year with all the windows and doors closed up, and we're breathing that air. And we never really bother to think too much about what's in that air that we're breathing. The carpet, the plywood, the paint on the walls, the cabinetry, The wood furniture in our homes, many of them are made from materials that are glued together. And those glues will off-gas volatile organic compounds, creating an indoor air quality issue for us. Over the years since, let's say, the building boom back in the 1950s, we've gotten smarter about building tight homes, meaning there's less air leakage. We've sealed them up pretty well, but that means that there's no air exchange. So the air inside gets a little stale, and if these chemicals are building, it becomes a relatively unhealthy indoor air quality environment. And the final one is resource usage, and someone mentioned that earlier. Thinking about where do the materials that are going into my home come from? Are they a local natural material like straw, which is what I built my home out of? Is it a wood product? And if so, where was that wood harvested and what impact? Am I able to use any salvaged materials, things that came out of old buildings that I can turn around and buy, doors, windows, flooring materials, things such as that? And to what extent are the materials I'm weaving into my home made from recycled products? Had a previous life and now I'm giving them a second life again. And so those are the 5 things that I often encourage people to think about if you're building from scratch, if you're doing a remodel, making a new purchase in terms of appliances, or just with the everyday lifestyle choices that you may be making. And so when it came time for us to design and build our own home, we weighed all of these factors. Our goal was to build as green a house as possible. Now, what exactly does that mean? That was up to us to determine what does green mean to us. And so we started with our property. It's a 5-acre lot in Berkeley County, West Virginia, just north of Martinsburg. The first thing we did was figure out the orientation of our home. South is that away, that's the way we're pointing our house for that passive solar gain that I mentioned earlier. It's a no-brainer. If you live in an existing home, it's a little hard now to turn your house that way. But if you're building from scratch, that's the first consideration you need to make. What we did then, we erected a post and beam framework. So we had timbers, like in an old barn, 6x6 posts that go up, 6x10, 6x12 beams that go across. And so there's the inside of our house, and you can see our post and beam. That created the framework or the skeleton for our home. Our home is actually a hybrid house. It is primarily straw bale, but we also use something called a structural insulated panel, or SIP. And a structural insulated panel, here's a good view of it. If you see that panel that's being craned onto my roof, it looks like an ice cream sandwich. And it is basically just like that. The white part inside is a foam material. That's the insulating component. And then the cookie part on the outside of the ice cream sandwich is an OSB, oriented strand board plywood. And these panels are both structural and insulating. So as you look up at that roof, it may be a little hard to tell in the picture, there's no framing up there. We didn't have to run rafters, we didn't have to have our carpenters scurrying all about at great heights and great risk to themselves. These panels came pre-manufactured. They were hoisted up with a crane.
Is this house be built where there's a lot of snow?
Absolutely.
And it would still
Yes.
be okay?
Absolutely. So she's asking the question about snow loads. I used to live in Minnesota. We got our fair share of snow out there. Yeah, and so these panels are rated for certain snow loads. And so you would do an engineering process to make sure that your house is not going to cave in under a snow load if you lived in one of those climates. And so we did structural insulated panels on the east side of the house and on the roof. The panel that you see being swung onto that house on the roof is about 10 inches thick. And the R value of that panel is better than 44. Remember, building code is 19. The Department of Energy recommends a minimum of 38. We could have gone thicker, but you get to a point of diminishing returns when you talk about insulation. So we went with a 10-inch panel for an R value of 38, or I'm sorry, an R value of 44. And this is the part that sort of draws people's attention. You built your house out of straw. Why would anyone want to build a house out of straw? So tell me, why would we want to build a house out of straw? Local material. We bought it from a farmer down in Jefferson County, West Virginia. The guy could not believe we were building a house out of his straw. 650 bales of straw we purchased from him. So very local. What other benefit of straw though? Insulation. Economic. It could be cheaper. In terms of the overall price scheme of a house though, the walls are not usually one of the higher expense items. And so we were able to save some money perhaps, but maybe not a significant amount. But at $5 a bale, we did okay. Well, where were you 5 years ago? What else? Insulation value. Now, straw by itself actually is not a great insulator. You talk about insulators, you're usually talking about an R value or heat resistance value per inch of material. An inch of straw is not great compared to, let's say, an inch of foam or even an inch of fiberglass, perhaps. The benefit of the straw, though, is that it's very thick. So the bales that we set in our home were a pretty standard 18 inches deep. And so suddenly in the walls of my house with 18-inch straw bales in there and a few inches of plaster on each side, and I'll show you that here in a second, we're now up to an R value better than 40 in the walls. Building code is 13. That's the 2x4 house with the pink fluffy cotton candy insulation. And that's barely getting to 13 at that point. So what we were doing was building a super insulated house. And we did it in the style of an Amish barn raising. So we had friends and family come out, and over the course of, and the picture's a little washed out, I apologize, but friends and family come out, and over the course of a weekend, boom, 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 up went the walls of our house. So there's my friend Tom, who's retying a bale. We had to learn to sort of stitch bales together into different sizes and shapes. There's a picture of me leaning up in my attic. You can't see it here, but I have a pretty smug look on my face, and I don't know why I was feeling so smug. I didn't lay up one of those straw bales in that attic, but there we are. I was happy the attic gable end had been completed.
Did you have to treat the straw in any way?
No, we don't have to treat the straw. Why would you want to treat the straw? What are you concerned about?
Hey, when I put straw in my garden, I get weeds and I get...
Okay, when you put straw on your garden, so absolutely. Okay, so would you want to treat it? Okay, great, we're getting all the good critters now. We got bugs, we got mice, we got snakes. Absolutely. So often the first thing people talk about, you jumped right to the bugs. Often the first thing people ask about is, what about fire? Because straw burns, doesn't it? It burns well when it's all loose and fluffy and full of oxygen. But here you see the way the bales have gone up. These are all straw bales that you can see here. And again, we're getting a little washed out on the images. But when the bales are packed tight as they are, and then they're sealed over with plaster, there's very little oxygen in those walls, very little oxygen in those bales. Imagine throwing a phone book on a fire. It's not going to burst into flames. It's going to smolder around the edges, and then it's going to go out. Straw works the same way. So fire's not a problem. In fact, our home is fire rated better than a conventionally built home. Let's talk about bugs.
Insurance for that?
Yes, it did. Actually, we get a discount on our insurance, homeowner's insurance, as a result of that. Well, I don't recommend that. Let's talk after the fact. Let's talk about bugs. This is straw we're talking about here. It's not hay. There's no food value in straw. In fact, even termites will not eat straw. Now, they won't. Now, mice, you might think this is a pretty tempting little habitat for mice, or snakes. I happen to like snakes myself. They take care of the mice, so it all works out. Again, these walls are packed pretty tight and sealed pretty well. It would be a pretty determined mouse that would chew through 3 inches of exterior plaster stucco to get into my straw bale.
I thought once you make a bale, sometimes you find critters in a bale.
Well, that we were pretty careful about. You know, we were looking at, even though there were 650 of them, we handled every one of them and made sure that they were solidly, put together and no critters inside that we were aware of. So my neighbor's house with the vinyl siding and the pink cotton candy insulation is a much better home for mice than mine. So we haven't had a problem along that line at all. Now, I heard the woman who was making the announcements over there, and everybody references when they hear about a straw house, you got to go back to the 3 little pigs and the big bad wolf. We're not worried about him. The only concern we do have is water, because on your garden, when you spread that out and it gets wet, it begins to rot. You get mold, you get weeds growing up through it, but that's a different kind of issue. We did not want our bales to get wet because then they would mold and they'd begin to rot and decompose, and that's not something you want inside your walls. So we made sure the bales were purchased dry. You can do a moisture test. We needed to have them below 16% moisture. After 16%, that's when the decomposers and fungi get activated. Buy them dry, transport them dry, store them dry. The roof was already on the house at the time we put the bale walls up, so they were protected from the top. The edges are exposed, as you see, and in fact, the house looked like this for about a year. So we have good overhangs on the house, because remember, passive solar, good overhang. And so the edges of the bales could get wet in a driving rain, much maybe like what we had earlier today or yesterday. But as long as it was just the edge, they would dry back out again very easily. What we had to avoid was any water getting down through the middle of that 18-inch thick straw bale. That would have been a problem. Okay, so that's what the house looks more or less all baled out, with a little more baling to do. And the next step then is to put mud on the walls, literally. because the interior walls are plastered over with a clay-based plaster. We harvested local clay, mix it with some sand, throw in a little chopped straw for tensile strength, and that's what goes on the wall. So here we're mixing up some of that. The initial material that we made was an extra sticky version of plaster we call peanut butter, because that's kind of what it resembled. And so we'd mix it up in those buckets and just by hand. You ever play with mud pies when you were a kid? It was great fun. Scoop it out, smear it on the walls, and that allowed us to sort of craft the shape the walls would take.
On both sides, or are you talking?
Just the inside. I'll get to the outside in just a second.
How many years did that take?
How many years did that take? Well, the process picked up speed a little bit. What we were able to do was, and I'll show you here in this next picture, this is the walls plastered. The first coat of plaster, you do 3 coats. And what you can see here along the edges where the windows are going to go, it got a little rough. Those bales went in and then got trimmed, and we trimmed them with a chainsaw. And if you've ever tried to do that with a straw bale, you get a lot of raggedy, kind of rough edges. That's where the peanut butter came in. It allowed us to sort of sculpt and smooth those edges. But the plaster itself was applied with a very traditional way, what's called a hawk and a trowel. The hawk is that flat thing that you load the plaster on, the trowel goes on, and it goes much faster than you might think. So this is the house with the first coat of plaster on it. Here we're getting in now to the finished coat of plaster, and what you'll notice is we changed colors. So the first 2 coats of plaster we used native clay, which is that sort of reddish, orangey buckskin color is what I like to call it. That was a lovely color, but a little too dark for the whole house. So in the final coat, we switched and went to a pottery clay called kaolin. It's a white clay, it comes out of Georgia. And that brightened things up a little bit, and so here's what it looks like finished. So sort of a creamy white color on the wall.
Very colonial to the way they would make it back then.
Well,
did you look up the information on how they? I mean, some of those homes are still standing.
Well, sure. The old style homes that are built with, lath and plaster walls, absolutely.
I was gonna say, a lot of them did with the walls.
Yeah, just like that.
Then you put your electric conduits in there before.
Yes, actually, I can show you. Maybe. There you go. So here's a regular wall in the foreground. That's a regular interior wall. We built that with 2x4s and eventually drywalled over it. So the electrical runs through that like it does normally, but right here you can see an electrical box that is buried in the straw wall. And so once again, we broke out the chainsaw, cut a little channel, run the wire along, pin it in place, and then plaster over it. And the box and the wire stay put. Not a problem. So this is what the house looked like when the plaster was finished on the inside. Now let's get to the outside. If we lived in the Southwest, Colorado, New Mexico, where straw bale buildings are a little more common than they are here, we would have done clay on the outside as well. Sort of like adobe, if you think of it in that way. Drier climate, better suited for that. In this kind of climate, given what we just experienced the last couple of days, things get a little wet around here. We needed a more weather-durable siding on the house, and so we changed up and went to a lime-based material. And you talked about colonial, and this goes back to early colonial period here in this country, but even further back in Europe. This is an old-school European kind of finish. It's a lime material, which is powdered agricultural lime. You probably all encountered that before. Soaked or slaked for a period of time. We soaked ours for about 6 months, actually. And what you get is what's called lime putty. Think of vanilla pudding. Take the vanilla pudding, mix it with some sand, and that's what's on the outside of my house. Whereas the clay plaster inside dries out and then hardens. What this does is it undergoes a chemical process of carbonation. It reacts with the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it sort of turns back into the limestone that it once was. That's where lime comes from. It's pulverized limestone with the impurities burned out. And so the exterior of my home is basically like a limestone sheet. It's pretty solid. Believe me, I had to break through it on 1 or 2 occasions. Exactly. Yeah. So here's what that looks like going on. There's Fred doing some of that plastering. You see he's working with the hawk and the trowel. And that's one of the ends of my home with the lime plaster finished there on it. Can all you folks see okay? You can't? I'm sorry. Do you want to slide over here? I have to stay in here because my man Jeff back there is filming this. Okay. I'm sorry.
Hey, Jeff.
Okay. I can move around? Well, I don't want to be in the projection either, so I'll hang here if that works. Please.
My question is, how do you attach externals
to that, or am I jumping ahead of the story?
No, you're fine. Let's talk about both internal or external. If we want to hang things on the wall, or if we want to attach. Give me an example of an external that you might want to put on your house.
My lighting fixture, like an outside,
Okay.
lighting, or
What
a dish, TV dish, or something
Sure.
that would be attached to the wall.
What we would have done with lighting is the electrical would have been run before that stucco went up. So the box was already there, we plaster to it, and then the light is already fixed in place. Let's say we need to put an electrical light on later after the fact. We have 3 inches of plaster. We can drill through that with a masonry bit on a drill, and we can make an attachment, and that stuff is strong enough to hold a fair amount of weight. On the inside, we do the same thing. It's 3 inches, this time clay plaster on the inside. We can drill a hole, put a picture hanger in, and hang a picture. If we were going to hang something that was pretty heavy, let's say a big fancy antique mirror or a plate rack or TV, we'd have to think about the TV a little carefully, though they're not as heavy as some things could be. There we would have thought ahead and put in some reinforcing wood in the bale, plastered over it, and then we remember where that's located, we could have attached to that. That's how we would have worked
Can
that.
I ask a woman's question?
Please, I'll try to give a woman's answer
When
if
you
that
want
was.
to rechange your room and redecorate.
I'm sorry, what are you talking about? Redecorate? Kidding me? No, go ahead, I'm sorry.
And
There
you
you
want to
go.
change all your walls,
Meaning color?
Well, no, not just this, when you want to redecorate the pictures.
Have you been talking to my wife?
I mean,
Now you know what I'm up against.
would you have to replaster, seal it up, and then repaint, and then move
So
the picture?
if we have a picture in one place and we...
That I never did.
No, it would be fairly easy to do that. Yes, we can do touch-ups.
But you do like plaster.
We
like the
mix
nail
up we
holes.
mix up a little bit. It's very repairable.
Oh, okay.
So if it gets dinged or dented or cracked or whatever, it's fairly easy to do a patch. Similar to what you'd have to patch with drywall if you need to do it that way. Yep. Not much more difficult than that.
Because I couldn't look how it could change.
Okay, so that's the envelope of the house. Now let's talk about what we did inside in terms of some of the systems of the house. In particular, here we built this super insulated house. How do we keep it warm in the winter? Well, we do that in 3 ways. We already talked about one of them, passive solar gain. In the wintertime, on a bright sunny winter day, the sun shines all the way into my house and warms things up very nicely. We also put in a high efficiency wood burning heater. It's called a masonry heater. It's basically a wood stove encased in stonework, just as you see here. I'll talk a little more about how that works on the next slide. Along with the masonry heater on the first floor of our home, which is a concrete floor, we also ran radiant heat tubing. When we turn this system on, hot water flows through that tubing, spreads out through that concrete floor, and creates a really, really comfortable source of heat. So here's what the finished floor looks like. There's our concrete floor. Before we stained it, we didn't leave it gray that way. There's the masonry heater you can see, and now the tubes are all underneath that concrete.
So if it's a concrete floor and you had a problem with one of the pipes,
I'm hoping that never happens. Not the chainsaw, jackhammer in that case, but these, we wouldn't have installed this system if we didn't have a lot of faith in it. They used to have problems with these, what are called hydronic systems. And they weren't using this particular kind of piping material. This is what's called a cross-hex polyethylene material. It's very durable. It shouldn't be going anywhere, but if we ever determine a problem, well, then we'll have to get in there and fix it. So here's how the masonry heater works. Anyone not familiar with a regular wood stove? You know how that works, right? The black metal box, you fire the thing up. When it gets real hot, it starts to glow a little pale red. You can't even get near the thing. And a lot of the heat goes right out through the flue. What this does is it captures more of the heat through a series of maze-like chambers. The fire burns hot and fast. There's a lot of juice behind it. You don't choke it back. You don't dampen off the air. You allow it to burn full throttle. It's like an inferno in there at times. But the heat is tempered by the stonework. So you can go right up to it when it's burning and not, be repelled by waves of heat. And the heat, the hot gases travel through a maze-like series of chambers underneath the stonework, maximizing the exchange of heat into the stone. And so when the fire goes out, and we only burn it in the height of winter, we burn it twice a day for about 90 minutes a day. It's not like a regular wood stove you have to keep feeding. We burn it, fire's done, we seal it up with a rooftop damper up on the chimney, and all the heat stays in the system. And the stones get warm, and the stones radiate out that heat over time. In fact, we've had this thing fully charged with heat, where the stones are warm to the touch, and we can go away for the weekend. Come back 48 hours later, the stones are still warm.
Does it blow out air?
It does not blow out air. It's a radiant kind of heat. So
Any smoke?
the fire burns so hot that much of the impurities in the wood are burned up. We don't have a problem with creosote buildup in the chimney. It's a very clean burning kind of thing, so we don't have a lot of smoke. It's a great system.
How much wood do you have to put in there?
We fill it up, with maybe about that much wood. Regular size, like 16 inch. We usually do it first thing in the morning, and then maybe sometime around dinner or right after dinner in the evening. That's all it takes. Yeah. It's a great system. These emanated out of Eastern Europe, where it gets really cold. And there was not a lot of wood available. So it provides excellent heat for minimal wood. And that's what we're going for. In our home, we decided to do some things a little differently with our wastewater. We did not install a regular kind of septic system and a regular kind of toilet system. Instead, we installed a composting toilet system. For those of you who are not familiar with that, the idea of composting is through the natural process of decomposition, our waste through the toilet will get broken down in this chamber, which lives in our basement. So this tank is connected to 3 toilets. In the image that you'd see today, there are 3 black chutes coming up through the top of that. Each one of those black chutes connects to a toilet that looks like this, that's in one of our bathrooms. It looks like a regular toilet, it's just missing a tank. There's no water, there's no flush. When you open it, because I know you're all curious about what happens when you look inside, it's just a big black hole that feeds down into that tank. There's a fan, because I know what you're thinking now, doesn't this thing stink? There's a fan that always pulls air downward. So when you open the lid, you're not, overwhelmed by a wonderful odor emanating up from the basement. And so this is a waterless toilet system. So again, talking about water efficiency. After a period of time, when the human waste is decomposed, human waste is largely nitrogen. What we do periodically is add wood shavings to it. That's carbon. Carbon and nitrogen together create the composting formula. And in the end, what I'm able to do every about 2 or 3 years, that's all I have to do, is go in through this bottom hatch and remove finished compost, which basically looks like soil. It smells like soil. Pathogens have been killed off through the composting process. It's clean. We use it as a fertilizer around our fruit trees, flower beds, and so forth. Really, you don't have to. It's a 12-inch pipe.
You gotta know, and you're like sick to your stomach.
Well, if we had,
Out the bottom.
Well, now I asked that very question of the manufacturer of this system. I said, so how do you clean this thing? I'm picturing like a chimney sweep, with the brush. And he said, Jeff, the pipe is smooth plastic. Anything that hits the sides of it, even if it sticks, because of the airflow, it's going to dry out over time and just flake right off. So I've not had to clean this at all. If we needed to, some of you have been to my home. Jen, you want to comment on that, on the cleanliness of our... Should I hold my ears just in case you want to be honest? Okay.
No, it's clean, it's lovely. I've been using that toilet once a week for a while there. Sometimes twice a week. Never a problem, never an odor, and always toasty warm, by the way.
Well, true, it backs up to the heater. So that takes care of our human waste. What about the other wastewater in our home? Sinks, showers, that has to go somewhere. And so again, rather than go with a traditional septic setup, we built a series of wetlands. The wastewater from sinks and showers is what's called gray water. Anything through the toilet is called black water. It's contaminated with potential viruses and pathogens that could make us sick. Gray water maybe has a little hair, some food particles, maybe some soap, stuff like that. And that then flushes into a series of wetlands that we built. Here's wetland number 1. It's a lined wetland. Think of like a swimming pool with about 6 inches of gravel in the bottom. And there's a series of pipes underneath that gravel that carry that gray water through there. And then into that wetland we planted cattails and rushes and reeds, wetland plants. And on the root hairs of those wetland plants are little microorganisms that eat any of the bacteria or other digestible materials that are in that gray water. Think Pac-Man, that's what I'm picturing it to be, like little Pac-Men and Pac-Women down there doing their thing. When that gets up to a certain level, there's a pump that kicks on and pumps it up to a second wetland, which works as like our leach field, allowing that now cleaned up gray water to percolate back down into the groundwater. And so here's what it looks like early in its production. We have it all planted. You can see some of the wetland plants that are in there. The wetland is now full of cattails and rushes and reeds, so you can't hardly even see the gravel any longer. That's how much it's filled up over the years.
In the wintertime, it still works?
It works in the wintertime because that biological activity generates warmth, and so it doesn't freeze on us. With regard to indoor air quality, remember that's a consideration as well. We were very careful about every material that came into our home. The cabinetry that we installed is made from wheat. It doesn't have glues or adhesives that will off-gas VOCs. The countertops in our home are made from recycled paper. Again, no glues or adhesives. This is what the countertops look like. They look like black marble or black granite, but they're not held together with any glue or adhesive that's going to create an off-gassing issue. We don't have carpet in the house. Any paint we've used, we've been very careful to get no VOC paint. So again, we're maximizing the quality of our indoor air. And so here's the nearly finished product. It's never really going to be finished. That's why I say nearly finished. That's what the house looks like. What you're looking at there is the east side of the house. That's where we used some of those SIPs. That's the entryway. A little more of the entryway. This is before the concrete floor got stained. You'll see a picture of that here in just a second. Little balcony off our bedroom. A little window that we had put together for a dormer. This is a cherry floor. Remember we talked about origin, the importance of understanding where your materials come from? This was a blowdown tree at my wife's family's farm. And I was out there one day and I noticed the cherry tree was out by the old family cemetery, and I said to my father-in-law, I said, Dwayne, what are you going to do with that cherry tree out there? And he said, Jeff, you want it? No, it makes great firewood. I said, I want it, not for firewood. I mean, it was a tremendous tree. And we had it milled. Cut into planks. We took it to the planing mill, made it into flooring, and that's the floor now that we have in our bedroom. Shortly after the cherry tree came down, a maple also came down. I harvested that in the same way. The neighbors at the farm swear they heard a chainsaw running in the middle of the night, but it was not me. Believe me. Here's another section of floor. We did a little earthen floor in the house, just for something a little different. In the straw bale wall, you're able to, because you have such deep walls, you're able to carve little niches. So we put a little niche in. There's the concrete floor. It's sealed with a soy-based concrete stain. And again, my apologies, the picture's a little washed out. This is what's called a truth window. Once you plaster over all the straw, it's always tradition in a straw bale home to leave a little bit exposed. And so you can see the straw kind of exposed there in the middle of that sun that my wife Kristin sculpted. That's what the house looks like from the south side. It has a little more finish to it now than it did back in 2007 when the shot was taken. And that's kind of what it looks like from up the road.
The balcony is totally supported by the outside wall?
The balcony is cantilevered off.
It's tied into the
tied into the framing. Yep. You mean the balcony off our bedroom?
Yes.
Yeah. If you'd like to see more of our home, and I raced through it fairly quickly because again time was tight, we do have a blog, a construction blog. You can start at the very beginning from site prep and go all the way through the finished product. You can check that out if you'd like. I can pop that back up there if anybody wants to. And thank you.